Welcome to the Masterclass Series hosted by UC Business School, MBA Program and Executive Education. Today we're welcoming Doug Steiner, who is going to introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Doug Steiner and I'm an entrepreneur based here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and as well as in Canada. And I'm an Edmund Hillary Fellow, and I've come to the country to help design and operate social impact processes, both in investing and hopefully in academia.
In the MBA program and in the business school in general, we're so invested in our local business community and the business community throughout New Zealand. And when you said you were visiting us, we jumped on this opportunity to you've been involved in so many businesses, so many both kind of entrepreneurial ecosystems, both from a private point of view, being involved in the businesses yourself, but also from a government point of view. Can you maybe talk about some of that government experience and then private experience that you've had?
Yeah, I started working for a very large investment bank in Toronto, and then over a period of time decided I wanted to do something by myself. So had an entrepreneurial track that I started almost 25 years ago, starting my own business, building it up and then selling it. And then for the last 15 years, I've been basically helping other people invest in companies. I've started a few businesses of my own with my business partner in Toronto. But the most fun thing that I've done recently is to try and convince government to innovate, which I think is what you want to talk to me about
Yeah,
today.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think also what's really interesting to me, and this is how I always explain you to other people, is that you're one of the people who knows the most about New Zealand of everyone I know, and you're only part-time based here.
Yeah, my wife and I arrived almost 7 months ago to the country, did something that I thought would be important, which is to try and travel around the country as much as I can, talking to people, civic leaders, but also entrepreneurs and just normal business people. So we started in Auckland in September, and we're finishing at the beginning of April. We'll have driven 12,000 kilometers in the country, visited most of the cities, and talked to a lot of people. And have formed some pretty strong opinions about how interesting this country is and how people like me who come from overseas can help, just with some experience that we have and more learnings that we can give to other people in this country about how to be successful.
And thank you for that. Thank you for that absolute investment that you're making in New Zealand and in UC in particular as well.
Yeah, thank you. The start of this was the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, which is, I don't know that many people know about the fellowship program because it hasn't been marketed very effectively in New Zealand. But there's a total of 530 fellows. The program was started almost 6 years ago. It was an experimental visa program of which I'm a recipient of an investor visa. So I am an entrepreneur, but one of the criteria for becoming an entrepreneur in the visa was that you had to have a business plan. And I just thought it was easier and more expedient to be an investor. I'm happy to be an entrepreneur here in the country as well. But the program has attracted 110 investors through that program from all over the world. There's investors from the US and Canada, but also from Eastern Europe and Asia as well. And all of us are trying to do the same thing. We're trying to basically have an impact initially in New Zealand, and then more importantly, can we give our talent and time to organizations where they can basically start to become world leaders in this country.
What are the gaps that you see in the New Zealand entrepreneurial ecosystem? I mean, you hear these colloquial stories about people, as soon as they become big, they just leave. Is that something that you've experienced?
Yes. So you have to understand that New Zealand is a very small country. I come from a city that is larger than this whole country in population. And that has its own problems, which is there's not enough scale for certain things here. But I think balancing the scale issue out are things like what we've learned from COVID, which is you don't have to be in a physical location to actually be successful. New Zealand is uniquely placed time-wise, for example, to be a nice place to work in. It's a 3-hour time change for most of the year to California, which is exactly the same time change that New York would have to California, as example. I'm still working very effectively in Canada early in the morning, where it's a 6-hour time change to where I live. So I can spend between 6 o'clock in the morning and noon basically being fully functional in Canada and in the afternoon being fully functional in New Zealand. And I think these are small things that people don't really appreciate in this country. The other thing is that I think a lot of people think that the problems here are problems unique to Kiwis, and they're not. For example, I've heard people complain about the lack of capital, where there's lack of capital everywhere. I've heard people complain about the medical system and immigration and emigration issues with people leaving and going to Australia. We have the same problems in Canada with people being lured to the United States. Both my children are entrepreneurs and live in the U.S. It's not a big issue. They might come home at some point, and I think a lot of Kiwis come home. But the point I made, I wrote an op-ed in the New Zealand Herald last April, which is I don't think people understand how good this place is and how much better it's going to be in the future if people want to be entrepreneurial. For example, you can work here. There's an immigration policy that if you're an engineer or you're a doctor or even things as obtuse as halal butchery, there's basically a call out for people to get permanent resident visas here. So I think the New Zealand government is being very proactive, the immigration people especially with specialized fields, to make sure that there's enough people here to get the economy going. But what I'm very interested in is can we attract even more people like me here to take the time to advise or to invest in companies that might have a chance of doing something a lot bigger than just being effective companies in the domestic market.
And what's that first step? If you have an idea and where does it all fit in? What is that?
So I guess I've spoken to enough people where I understand the ecosystem, current innovation ecosystem has some great pieces and some missing pieces. So the great pieces are, there is enough capital for startups and seed-based companies. What there isn't enough capital for is for growth. This is and especially in the technology industry where you do need heaps of capital when businesses are growing really quickly, especially internationally. There's just not enough people that are prepared to continue to invest in companies or enough capital currently that's organized properly to do second round or third round fundings. And I think venture firms, the larger ones, are starting to get into a follow-on investment portfolio funds so they can continue to do that. But it's very easy to jump on a plane and fly from Auckland to San Francisco and raise money in Silicon Valley for technology companies. And I think over a period of time, what the government should do is encourage people to look at specialized funds for this country to be able to keep people here and keep the capital here as well.
And what's the role of government in this? And
so one of the things I think, and this is going to be controversial, is I don't think government has enough of a point of view and a policy agenda around innovation and business success. I think and it's a very complicated process because you have to look for centers of excellence usually. You can't be good at everything. There are fields of excellence and centers of excellence already in agricultural technology, and I think in space technology, for example, which is a more recent thing. But I think we're going into an election year. This is the beginning of 2023, and I think it's becoming on everyone who are interested to push government to basically say, are there written policy agendas around innovation and business? And there's going to be a very contested election, I feel, between the two main parties. And I think the people that articulate in writing to the business community what they're trying to do, especially around innovation, it could be the deciding factor of who forms the government in this country next October.
Yeah, there are all these kind of startups and incubators and all of that around.
There are a lot. There's a loosely knit system, I think, in this country that I found of feeder and finders. There's a big infrastructure here in Christchurch, for example, with organizations like the Ministry of Awesome that are trying to find the smallest and the most effective way of funding start companies.
I have to also add, Think Lab and Christchurch NZ.
They're all working together. I just think when you're talking to venture capital firms, they are relying on these firms to bird dog and find the smaller companies. The same issues happen in Canada and the US. Is you have to educate very young entrepreneurs usually about what it takes to start a company, and it's hard. And people like me that are investors, we're demanding people. We're very nice, and we'll advise people on business ideas all the time, but when it comes time to write a check, we turn into normal economic animals, and we want to see a business plan, and we want to see passion, and we want to see a financial infrastructure and a path to growth. So I think this isn't a free lunch for people coming here, and I think the ecosystem in New Zealand is very good at the startup level, so at the seed and startup level. You can find money if you have a good idea and you're organized properly. I'm not saying that everybody with a great idea gets funded in this country. There's lots of people with not great ideas that get funded as well, but that's the part of the venture capital world. But I think what happens is over a period of time, if a company is successful, then they end up, as I say, finding the further investment capital overseas and perhaps moving over there as well.
Where the goal should be to keep those companies?
Yes, or to keep engineers in this country working. And I think one of the other things that I've been very interested in, these are where there are holes in the, I would say, in the thought process and policy around this is a nice country to come. One of the reasons we're here at this time of year is it's very cold in Canada, and I'd like to be in a warm place. But I think there's a lot of people that would love to come here and work remotely, and there's no policy in New Zealand to allow engineers, for example, to come and work remotely. There's a firm in Canada that has been working with the government to get U.S. engineers that lose H-1B visas to come and work in Canada for the same company that they're working for in the U.S. And I'd like to encourage the government to think about doing similar types of programs where they can just get people to come here and work. There are issues around that with housing, and people don't like, I think generally people just showing up and working hard, but if you have a high salaried person and you want to get them to be part of the community, especially if they're younger, they will come in here, they will start working hard, they'll fall in love, and they'll decide they'll want to stay. And what's happening in Canada is these people are deciding to stay in Canada and work for Canadian companies, and I think you can do that here.
So given all these kind of issues and opportunities, how do governments and entrepreneurs work better together?
I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, as an entrepreneur, how entrepreneurs and government can work more effectively together, and it's quite difficult. And one of the things I've been trying to teach people is what are the behavioral differences for people who work in government and entrepreneurs. And I think a lot of people focus on the greatness and the wonderful thing of being an entrepreneur, but it takes a certain type of person. So what I want to do is I want to explain a little bit about what I think entrepreneurs are like and what I think government employees are like, and what government policy is like and what people starting new businesses try and do, and try and merge the two together, which I've done actually, I think, successfully with one example in Canada. First of all, entrepreneurs are what I call uninformed optimists. They actually don't really know whether they're going to be successful or not, but they have to believe they have to be, even when they have no knowledge of how their business is going to turn out. And if you don't, if you're not an uninformed optimist, you never start a business because you'll talk yourself out of it. So compare that with somebody who's worked for a long time in the government, who have been told that there's processes in place, not events that they have to deal with like an entrepreneur, but processes in place they have to adhere to. So when entrepreneurs approach a government person and say, hey, I've got this great idea, it'll make your life better or you'll be more efficient, the first thing a government person thinks about is the risk they have to take to employ something that's new. And a lot of government people don't take risk. For example, if you try and sell something to a government and say it'll be better, the chances of you being successful, I think, are quite low. But if you go to the government and say, if you don't buy my product, you could lose your job, I'm being rude about it, is that you have to basically point out that there's a risk of not adopting new technology innovation that is a consequence of your employment or whatever is happening to you in government. So I'll give you a very good example. We've had a cyclone here which has devastated the infrastructure in this country. And I'm going to be very interested to see how innovative the government's going to be, because they will be incredibly innovative in fixing this infrastructure. And the reason they're going to be innovative is if they don't do it, the government will get thrown out of power. People will be upset. People are now expecting the government to be innovative, to change. And this happens a lot of time when there's a crisis, for example, COVID. And I watched what happened. Trying to buy government or procure government services during COVID was impossible. But if you were working on COVID, in New Zealand and Canada were no different, there was unlimited amounts of money and there were unlimited amounts of ideas that got implemented in a very quick period of time. But the reason for that is government has various levels of people that have various behavioral optimization processes. So at the very top are elected officials, and their behavioral process is popularity. So they want to get reelected. And not to belabor the point, but most politicians will work very, very hard to say anything or do anything to be reelected. Now, they have to perform as well, but a lot of politicians, as we've seen all over the world, don't have to do a lot. They just have to say a lot and they'll get reelected. But that's very different from getting something done.
Yeah.
So, for example, I've been into government and said, here's a fantastic program. It'll save consumers millions of dollars. And the response I've had directly from elected officials is, I don't think people understand it. If they don't understand it, they're not going to vote for me. So I'm not implementing it.
Yeah.
So that's a normal reaction. One level below that in government are bureaucrats, deputy ministers, people who have to make sure the government runs efficiently. It's done in the lowest cost possible, even though people might not think that way. And the chance of them taking a risk on doing something new is incredibly low because they don't get paid to take risk. They get paid to make sure things run. Mm-hmm. Below that in government, you'll find individuals who want to change things, and those are the people you have to find. So when I talk to entrepreneurs, I say try and find people that want to change things in government, and it's hard. Mm-hmm. So you have to basically have a friend. I look at, for example, the HF visa program, which was the Global Impact Visa, was only given out to less than 400 people. But it was a government initiative started by some low-level employees in the immigration department who thought this would be a great idea and were convinced and actually pushed it up through government to get it done. Yeah. And it's going to take years to figure it out, and that's the other issue with government is if an entrepreneur thinks things happen quickly or slowly selling to a large company, try selling to government. Yeah. So what I encourage people to do is when you think something's going to happen in a period of time, just double it or triple it. And you have to have the wherewithal and the capital to invest in a long-term relationship with government. And if you can't do that, there's no point in going to see them. Government typically throws people at problems when a lot of times they should be throwing technology at problems. Yeah. But because technology is purchased and they can control the HR processes a lot more, you'll find that just a technological optimization for example, a form automation or a function in any part of government requires RFP, technology, oversight, 3 bidders, time to come back and evaluate the bid versus just hiring some people and getting it done. Yeah. So in a lot of cases, it's a lot easier to hire a bunch of people and put them in front of a computer with an Excel spreadsheet rather than buying a database that would actually do something better. So
that first heuristic is language around risk versus opportunity and that time frame around that. What else?
I think there's entrenched bias to do things that you have to break in government. One of the things that I tried really hard to do is when governments say they want to do something, for me it was pushing back. I got into government as a consultant and said, okay, how committed are you to this? And they said, we're very committed. And I said, like, what are you going to do to change? And I think one of the things I explained to you was to ask them if they would change rules. Mm-hmm. Government runs on rules, and anybody who thinks they can sell or produce anything for government, it always has to fit into a real framework. So I think this is probably the most important thing is I went to the government in Canada and say, you should issue debit cards for people that get social services payments so you can actually track what they're spending money on, which is quite easy in the payment system. The response is we can't do that because there's no legislation that says we're allowed to issue cash on a debit card. We can send people a check or we can do direct deposit. Mm-hmm. So the things that I've learned are if you want to make innovative changes, you have to work on a legislative agenda at the same time you're talking to people. So you have to go to the people that are writing new rules to say, oh, we have a better technology that we can show you that we can produce for you, but are there rules that have to change in current legislation? Yeah. And that means you're working on a legislative agenda, you're working on a political voting agenda, and you're working on a normal work agenda at the same time. Mm. And it's the longest pole that you have to work to, and most of the times the longest pole is the laws that have to get changed. Yeah. For example, when I and my partners at the Securities Commission in Canada wanted to get changes made to some of the rules, to ask for that, they said, no, you can't just change regulatory environment. So we asked for an experimental trial to see if we could do some what are called exemptive relief applications, so we could give people essentially a get out of jail card for a period of time if we could do some oversight and work with them. And I think that that is in place now and should be a very effective way. The other thing with government is, and with any business where you're trying to get into bureaucracy, is to ask if you can do an experiment for a limited time with a limited amount of money to see if it'll work, rather than saying, do you want to change your whole process? And I think people are a lot more amenable to very small experimentation. So I think for a lot of things that I've tried to do, especially selling into big companies, is like just try one for a small period of time with this little area and see if it works, rather than saying we can change everything in here, it'll be fantastic. Because in the end, you've got to convince people individually that what you're doing is good for them and good for their careers. And don't ever make the mistake of thinking that people think if the organization does better, I'll do better. I think people are very selfish. The first thing is, if I buy this or if I do this new system, will I get fired? So the sales process for me in government is to try to slowly convince somebody that the risk of not implementing the service or the new technology or the innovative process you're trying to do is riskier for them over the long term, and so they should make the decision to do it based on the fact that this reduces risk rather than increases profitability or for optimization.
All these examples that you're giving us sound so high level. Policy changes, government changes, getting really senior people to talk to you and getting them to change things. But how does this relate to the average New Zealand entrepreneur who is in a small and medium enterprise, who just wants to take that next step in their business? And how should they be approaching government in this?
I think they have to find somebody that they know, or somebody that's interested in what they're doing. I think that's that's a basic sales technique for everything. Is you can't sell to anybody if they're not interested. Kiwis and Canadians are very similar. They're a little bit passive aggressive when they're looking at products and services, so they don't like to say no. So I tell people there's many ways that people say no, and I think for entrepreneurs you just have to listen to whether people are interested or not. So entrepreneurs get very excited, and they can get people very excited, but people make a decision based on what is good for them rather than how exciting it sounds like the pitch is. So you hear things like, let me think about it.
Yes.
Or let me get back to you. That means no to me. And I think what people have to do is they have to understand when people say no, if you're a good salesperson, you won't take no for an answer. So when somebody says, let me think about it, my response is, I haven't explained it properly to you. I'm going to come back and try again. But I think subtle cues, and I think there's a couple of very interesting books and some academic stuff written about how people see themselves and how they see other people. And I think one of the things that I've learned that's been the most effective is I got involved in technology very early, and I found even when I built very good technology that was much cheaper and easier to use, I couldn't believe that people wouldn't use it. And then I ended up talking to a person who later became my business partner, Dan Ariely, who was then at the MIT Media Lab. And he said, the reason that people won't buy your product is there's some other decision framework that you're trying to break down before they do it. So I explained what I was trying to do with them, and in my world it was electronic trading systems. And I couldn't get people that were on the phone trading securities to use my computer. And he said that's because the relationship that the person on the phone has with the person on the other end of the phone, and you don't appreciate that they have to break that relationship to start a new one with you. So when I started talking to people about those behavioral heuristics and the relationships, then it turned into this whole area of behavioral science and behavioral economics around how people make decisions. So I got so interested in that part of the world, which is how do people actually make decisions and change their mind, that I ended up being an entrepreneur and starting a business consulting in that area. And I think I learned more about people's ability to change and break habits around the work that we did in that area. First, we did a lot of work here in New Zealand as well as in other places in Europe and North America. And what we found out is, first of all, people have to like you to do business with you. And I think that is lost on a lot of young entrepreneurs is, I have a great business idea, but if you're arrogant about it, or you don't really seem to be passionate about it, or you're afraid to talk to somebody about it, you're not going to be successful. So if you're liked and people know who you are and they trust you, then you have a much higher chance of being successful in business. So I think it's the same with government. I don't think government's just a tougher nut to crack than a large company, and a large company is tougher nut to crack than a small company, and then somebody that really wants to work with you because they want to be a partner of yours. But I also have to advise small companies not to partner with other small companies, because two small people doesn't make a giant. It makes two small people standing on each other's shoulders. So it's very, very hard for a lot of entrepreneurs to not think that everybody wants to use their product or buy their product or use their service.
And why is it important for us to build those entrepreneurial government relationships?
I think over time, and there's been some very good examples of being innovative in government. I explained that there's a city in Canada that sent out challenges just to the public, and the response was quite amazing. And then even people like Elon Musk, who want him, like him or hate him, he has issued challenges that people have responded to in terms of large problems. So I think government can be really effective at calling out people on some of the problems they have, and they don't do that. I spoke to people here in Christchurch about an idea that I had about separating garbage. And I think people are very bad in this country compared to where I'm from about separating their garbage. And the way to do that would be to reward people, and the cheapest way to do that would be to give garbage collectors stickers that they could look into people's bins, see if they've separated their garbage properly, and if they have, to put a sticker on their bin. So I said the biggest advertising that a city has is on the outside of their bins. They can put advertising, they can get kids to market their whatever they want, because people come and drive by bins every day, but nobody has any advertising on them. So there's very simple ideas that I think innovators can present to government that are very cost effective to try and change behavior in a city. And if you think about the civic environment in Christchurch, for example, this is a city that has changed remarkably in the last 15 years because of what's happened here. But I think what's also very interesting is that there's challenges, civic challenges there's challenges at universities with everything, and then if you tell people what your challenges are and ask for them to respond, you're going to get amazing ideas coming out of the middle of nowhere. You just have to organize them.
That's the thing. I think that's an important role that universities play, is that platform for all these key stakeholders to engage with each other on.
Yes, and I'm very interested to see the danger that has happened to citizens in this country over weather and climate change over the last 3 months.
Yeah.
I think is going to be a remarkable, we're going to see a remarkable change in people's attitude to innovating to fix some of the issues. Because now there's been incredible infrastructure damage and loss of life. And I think politicians and government have to respond, and the way they're going to respond is going to be very interesting to see. And the more innovative and the quicker the response is going to be, and the more they engage the citizens of this country, the better off they're going to be.
And that's the sad fact, is the problems that we are faced with, not only in New Zealand, but if we look at Turkey and all these natural disasters, etc., it's not going to be just government or just civic society that solves those problems. It's going to be a partnership between everyone, and that's why it's important for that innovation ecosystem and for entrepreneurs to partner with government.
Absolutely, and there's been a history here. Obviously, it came out of tragedy that there's sophistication in technology and implementation of architecture in the city that obviously people in Syria and Turkey are going to have to adopt. And maybe that's something that the government should be promoting instead of sending cash. They're saying that we should send sophistication and technology there at the same time.
So you mentioned earlier that there are centers of excellence, and I know you and I have spoken about this too, that we should really focus on niche markets and niche skill sets. What are those centres of excellence that you see in New Zealand in general, and then Christchurch in particular, moving towards?
I'll do two. I'm going to be controversial in both of them. One is tourism. This is a wonderful country to visit. It has poor to moderate infrastructure to handle massive tourism. I've been in cities where cruise ships come in and they're overwhelmed in places like Picton and Tauranga. This is a hard place to get to. You can only really fly here. And I think of New Zealand in existential terms as a kind of an amusement park. And if government thought of it that way, I think they would charge a lot more for people to come here. I think people, tourists who come here want to be entertained. And I don't think there would be any problem with tourists paying a much higher entry fee to come to this country, just like you pay a high entry fee for a place where people want to be entertained, like Disneyland, or for a hockey game or a rugby game. But I think that's something that people have to test in this country. I don't want to stop people from coming here. You can rebate people through the money they spend in the country, but I think that's one idea that I'd like government to consider, which is if you suddenly said, for example, we have a carbon tax to come here because you're flying in a plane, you're not sailing here in a boat, very few people do that, and I'm sorry you have to pay a $150 carbon tax to come here. I don't think anybody would have a problem paying it.
They're already paying so much for that flight ticket.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to see if, and there's all sorts of remedies for people who can't afford it, but I think I'd be happily paid to say, look, we're trying to be a carbon neutral country, and if you want to come here, you got to get on the program.
Yeah, yeah.
So the other one is, and this is even more controversial, is in agricultural technology, and I've had very pleasant arguments with people who don't understand the difference in the quality of carbon capture between a forest and a grazing area, and I think people have to get educated on the cost of the agriculture in this agricultural economy. It's not a huge part of the economy anymore. I think people generally think it's larger than it is. It's double what it would be, more than double what it would be in Canada, but it's still not the largest driver of the economy. And I think if people really want to get serious about climate change and changing New Zealand's implementation of it, there's a lot of grassland here that should be used for sequestering carbon. That's very controversial. I understand that farmers don't want people buying their land to make pine forests, but I think longer term, if you start to think about being a farmer of other things and not being a cattle farmer, I've said to some people that farming, you guys have become very efficient at farming, but it's an old economy type of thing. It's very romantic, and it looks great. If lots of people do it, because there's lots of people doing it, and if you drive around this country, it's a very agricultural country versus my own. But I think getting people to think more innovatively of what agriculture really means, and is it really necessary just to have cattle farming and sheep farming as the main agricultural part, and can we do other things in this country? I just like that conversation to get started.
Yeah, absolutely. So tourism and agriculture.
More efficient, carbon neutral agriculture.
So how do we become more innovative as a university?
I think the university is a giant brain, and the brain doesn't move around too much. And I think one of the things that I'd be very interested in thinking through with you longer term, because I'm thinking about all the things I can do while I'm living here, is how do you spread the intellectual capital that this university has in other places? And I think one of the things that hampers universities is the physical location, just like in corporations. And I think what COVID's taught us is that you can start using the brain remotely. And in the world that I lived in when I designed the government department, we didn't have the restriction or the constraint of a physical location, and it turned out to be very good because we were able to get many people in remote locations. New Zealand is not a very large country. It's all in one time zone, and I would like to encourage all universities in this country to start thinking about how to expand that intellectual capital. So one of the things that I found is there's many smaller communities that would love to have a very small presence, a university presence from Canterbury or Otago or University of Auckland in their city, because it does foster student innovation, it fosters creativity. So I think one of the things I'm very interested in is, can universities basically stop thinking about the physical location? Unfortunately, the names of the universities is really bound around, a lot of universities globally are bound around the location. And to start to think about how they can build micro-campuses. So that would be one area that I'd be really, really interested in working on.
Doug, you're a serial entrepreneur. What businesses are you working on at the moment?
I've become very interested, and I think we've talked about this before, I'm very interested in data and the value of data. And my whole life, around a lot of the entrepreneurial activities I've done is trying to value information. And I've consulted in information that decays in value very quickly. Stock prices, for example, would be one area, and information that decays a little more slowly, like a newspaper, an article in a newspaper. But what's very important to people now is they're starting to realize that they have a lot of personal information that they want to keep personal. And I think one of the worst examples of this, obviously, is the monetization of personal data that's gone on in social media with large companies. So there's a lot of effort going into, can you basically keep the data that you have about yourself private, but only release the certain types of information that people need to validate something legally? I think of regulation, the most efficient regulation in government is our highway system. So we have licenses for drivers, we have certain widths of highways, we have speed limits, we drive on one side of the road, you know how to turn right and turn left. So I think people don't even think of highway systems and government regulation as being really onerous. You can't, consume alcohol and drive. There's all sorts of things that people are okay with. But as soon as we get into personal data, the government has no idea how to organize it all. So I think a lot of the efforts that I'm looking at is, can you design a system where if I want to buy alcohol, for example, I don't have to show my driver's license? Because as soon as I show my driver's license, I tell people my name, my age, which they need, but also my personal address. And I think young people going into bars where they're scanning driver's license is very dangerous, because it does give people the opportunity to take that information, do anything they want with it, including inflicting personal harm. So I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is, can I design a system, which I'm working on, where I can go in and just show on my phone my face and that I am over 19 years old to buy alcohol, for example, without showing my gender, where I live. So those are similar, some of the things that I'm very interested in. Yeah. The other side is around making sure that if people are using technology to move money, they're doing it legally, which is my regulatory hat. Yeah. In the crypto world and digital ledger world, it's not obvious to me that a lot of people are trying to do this legally. So I've been working with regulators to try and find business systems that we can use to validate people, and how we can use digital infrastructure, which is very efficient, but doing it legally.
I think you touched on something that's really interesting that I think a lot of new entrepreneurs struggle with, and that's monetization of the idea. Maybe they have an idea and they haven't figured out exactly how to diversify that monetization or to monetize in the first place. Or you get people who are really interested in specific areas, that they know that this is where they want to be, that's their passion, but they don't necessarily know how to monetize that. Do you have any advice around that?
It's a big question. It depends.
Yeah.
It depends on how quantitative you can be about the information that you're getting. For me, in finance, it's very obvious. In media, it's very obvious. And I think in social media, people stumbled on advertising as a way to do that, and unfortunately, it's at the expense of personal information. But I think if people think about protection of data and how to protect people, that's a very large field, and you can actually quantify some of those things. If you want to open a coffee shop, you're into a competitive environment. Yeah. There's a nice road to hoe, but those are still very meaningful and successful businesses that people start. So I don't want to tell people that they should just do things with information. Yeah. I'm looking at a business to invest in here in New Zealand that would be my first investment with an organization that has inventory, because I promised myself that inventory is hard to control, but I'm very enamored with this company, and I think they're going to be a great and large exporter, so I'm very interested in them. So I think it depends. It depends on how you think you can add value, and I don't want to encourage entrepreneurs just to start business, but to be entrepreneurial in existing businesses as well. And I think that's very important for MBA students and students at school, which is there's lots of people like me who can go in now as an entrepreneur and yell at people in government and say you should be more entrepreneurial, and they listen. And I think younger people can do the same thing if they've got a good idea and they research an older company or a company they think they should change, and they basically send a message to the CEO or the head of marketing and saying, I've studied your company and I think I can make you some more money with some of my ideas. If those people don't respond to those types of inquiries, you don't want to work at that firm.
Amazing. Thank you, Doug. Thank you for your time.